Hello! It's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with another episode of the Path to Victory series. This time we are covering Northern Quebec. And just to be clear, right at the start here, Northern Quebec is these writings, these ones, and then all of these except for these two, Gatineau and Ulmer. Those ones will be included with Ottawa when I cover Ottawa because they are part of Ottawa, for lack of better terms. They're not de jure Ottawa because they're in a different province, but it makes no sense to talk about them outside of talking about Ottawa as a whole. But here we have the rest of Quebec. So, you recall from last week, or last episode of this series, not last week, Southern Quebec is not competitive at all for the Conservatives, and they have no ridings going through Southern Quebec where they're competitive. You look at all of these ridings down here, and they're completely nothings to the Conservatives. There's some ridings that the Bloc are competitive in, but the Bloc isn't the Conservatives. In the story of government formation, you could argue they are friendly to the Conservatives, but in practice, they are ideologically not very similar. Many stances are quite different between the two. But when you get to Northern Quebec, things start getting different. There are some regions in Northern Quebec where it is actually legitimately competitive, and the Conservatives have reasonable chance, both historically and presently, based on just the last two elections, reason to believe they could gain a meaningful number of seats. Not one or two, but there is plenty of ridings that are conceivable wins for the Conservatives. Now, we'll get onto some of the more specific ones later, but let us get to the first stuff. So, we're just going to over time here. So, Northern Quebec as a whole, in the last 30 years, has played very similarly. There's really, again, like the rest of Canada, but specifically in Quebec, there's really two phases. You have 93 to about 08, and the 93 to 08 time period, what you really see is the Bloc starts really strong, and it slowly has tapered off. And for the most part, the Conservatives have gained the ground. The NDP has also gained quite a bit of ground, but I would contend most of the ground the NDP or the Greens are gaining is really at the expense of the Liberals here, because if we look here, the Liberals started at 26 in 93, go up to 42% in 2000, but by 2008 are down to 18%. Following 2008, you get obviously 2011, which is an exceptional election. It is quite interesting, in fact. Now, obviously, the NDP did quite well nationally in 2011, but in Quebec, especially Northern Quebec, it is extreme. We're looking at nearly a 31 point gain in a year. Well, 3 years, sorry, in one single election cycle. Not even just drawing support from the Liberals or the Bloc, but every other party lost voters relative to the NDP, which is quite interesting. But then within two election cycles, they've lost that, and now we're looking at the NDP sitting around 7. This is one of the times, specifically, where I think the averages are being skewed here. They're not very useful. For the Liberals, the NDP, the Greens, I think they have value. Actually, same thing with the PPC. But I think the Conservatives are being underestimated here by this 22%. They seem to be on the growth path. Again, you look 2011 to present, the last 4 election cycles, the last decade, they have an upward trajectory, gaining every single election, albeit 2019 wasn't much, but still. And prior to 2011, they were also around 29-33%. 2011 being a point where, again, the NDP took a bunch of their voters. So when you consider this, especially once you remove the bloc, what you get is Northern Quebec is actually pretty competitive for the Conservatives as a whole. You look here, just not considering the bloc, since the existence of the Conservative Party, really, 2004 being an exception because it's a brand new party, it's almost neck and neck, except again for aforesaid 2011 and 2015. But other than the time when the NDP were surging in Northern Quebec, it's been pretty close to neck and neck. Sometimes doing a little worse, sometimes doing a little better, like 2006. So there's lots of reason to believe this is a region the Conservatives could gain ground in. But let us go into some of the subregions first, just so we can start discussing this in more detail. So the first one here, we have Bas-Saint. So what I'm calling Bas-Saint is, I'm on the wrong layer. It's these regions here, these four ridings. This is technically Basin, Bas-Saint, but it's roughly covering the region, those two regions in Quebec, and I'm grouping them together specifically because they vote fairly similarly. Unlike the rest of not the rest, but much of Northern Quebec, they are more liberal friendly, they're less conservative, they're deeply bloc, except Gaspé's Ile-de-Madeleine. And the NDP is actually somewhat competitive here. You look in raw votes, kind of see the deal. 2011, they picked up a bunch of seats. 2015, they did quite well. You look at percentages, it's a bit more clear here. So you look at the last three election cycles, where I think this is really clear. Or let's say the last two, just so we don't have the NDP surge here. The NDP is kind of cratered away, but historically the NDP has had, again, quite a few points here competitive. 2011, 2015, 2019 even, really reasonably competitive. The bloc is strong. The Conservatives are kind of weak. And there's really not too... And the Conservative numbers are actually buoyed up a bit here because one of the regions that Conservatives typically win is included in the rest of this, but in the Bas-Laurent region, but the rest of it isn't competitive at all for the Conservatives. So we have this guy down here, where the Conservatives usually have been winning. And I would say, in general terms, it's kind of hard to imagine the Conservatives winning nationally and not winning this. I think it's possible. So I'm not going to put it the darkest version of the color, but it is hard to believe that could happen. Whereas, we look here, the rest of it, if you can remove this one, the Conservatives are basically not competitive in the rest of this region. The bloc is quite strong, the NDP is okay, and the Liberals are strong, especially in Gaspé's Ile-de-Madeleine and along the New Brunswick border. You look at general percentages, and you can get a better idea of this. This region has generally went about 68% to left-wing parties once you can ignore the bloc, with the one exception being 2006, because 2006 is sort of a surge year for the Conservatives in Quebec vis-a-vis the non-bloc parties. But the general gist here, this region is not very competitive. It's not one that the Conservatives really should be looking at to make gains, I should say. And it's generally just like this. We have two regions that are very solid bloc, which it's hard to imagine going to anyone else presently. Again, it's not impossible. The NDP did win some of these in the past while the bloc existed. But it's hard to imagine going forward the bloc winning here. Or not winning here. Then we get into the next of these regions, You have Saguenay, Côte Nord. And that is, generally speaking, this region. This region, conversely, is areas the Conservatives are both A, currently competitive in, and B, reasonably could make more gains in. Again, that's the raw votes. It's not as useful, so we're going to ignore those for a second. You look at percentages here. Basically, since the formation of the Conservative Party, other than 2015, the Conservatives have been reliably in second place in this entire region. And back in 2008, nearly came in first place. There's quite a reason to believe here that going forward, as Quebec is drifting more right-wing socially, and as the Conservative Party seems to be focusing more on social issues and less on specific economic issues, albeit it still focuses lots on economic issues, but more from a social lens than an economic lens, if you will. This region is 100% going to open up in competitiveness. Now, I don't think in a hypothetical 2025 election, all of it will be in play. Manicouagan over here is probably still going to say Bloc Heartland, even in a hypothetical nearby 2025 election with 2 more years of conservative growth. But Jonquière and Lac-Saint-Jean, here and here, are definitely in the realm of play. Yes, the Conservatives are generally down 10 to 20 points there right now, but they definitely have the capacity to gain that ground. These are regions that they have won in the past. With the right candidate selection, the right campaign platform, and the right campaign, these regions are definitely in consideration for the Conservatives. Albeit they're coming at it from behind. And then obviously you get Fjord, and while Martel's only winning by 10, it's pretty hard to imagine him losing right now as incumbent, but I will not give him the safest color because it's only a 10-point lead. So we have here, really, is Chicoutimi, Le Fjord. Sorry, Quebecois people watching this, I'm not great at French. This is mostly safe with Conservatives, and Jonquière and Lac-Saint-Jean are 100% competitive. I'm going to slightly color this differently. I'm going to actually go out on a limb here and say Jonquière, if the Conservatives want to win a majority, they need to win this riding. Or they should be able to win this riding, I should say. They don't need to, because again, what I'm coloring here isn't what they're currently doing right now. That's really important consideration. These are ridings that they can target, and they should reasonably have a chance of winning. If it's light blue, this lightest blue here means that this is a riding they can target, and they reasonably should be able to win. If it's like a light blue here, that means the Bloc should be able to win it, but it is conceivable the Conservatives could, or someone else could. Here, in this case, this is a case of the Liberals should be able to win it, so it gets a bit murky in some areas, but in this particular case, I think there is a very good chance a Conservative government would make this very competitive in a majority scenario. You get to Manicouagan. Again, I don't think I'm pronouncing this right, but you'll have to forgive me, Quebecois, if I have any of you in the audience. This is not particularly competitive. I think it will narrow, and I will not be surprised within the next 2 or 3 election cycles if this becomes competitive or Conservative riding. Because the trend that's been happening in Quebec, which I think a lot of people need to understand. We look here. We look at over time for or that's not really a great example. Oh wait, we have the seats. So over time, no, that's not really helpful. So I don't really have a good graphic for this. But over time, what's been happening in Quebec is there's been ridings in usually favorable Conservative regions. Any other part of the country, these would lean Conservative. So rural, for the most part, regions. And there's a long-term Bloc incumbent, and the Bloc incumbent resigns, and then it goes Conservative. And there is a lot of capacity for this to keep going, because a lot of these areas are very rural. Manicouagan, for example, is one of the largest ridings in Canada in geographic area. And there's not any there's plenty of towns, but there's not any huge cities in it, obviously. So it is an area anywhere else would be favorable to the Conservatives. Most of the other big rural areas, big rural ridings, I think Conservatives don't typically do well, like Northern Manitoba here, Northern Ontario, or like Northern BC. Well, something's going funky here, but Northern Ontario, Northern Manitoba, northern coast of BC, the territories, these areas where the Conservatives haven't traditionally done well in rural areas is largely because these areas are heavily Native American, and for various reasons, some of them I think not particularly good reasons, the Conservatives have done a very bad job of winning the trust and the votes of Native American voters. And that's a lot of the reason why some of these ridings haven't done well. In other places, such as southern Northern Ontario, the Great Lakes side of Northern Ontario, it's a lot of previous working class areas, or possibly still currently working class areas, a lot of mining, forestry, stuff like that. And consequently, usually blue collar and unionized, and previous iterations of conservatism in Canada haven't been very friendly to unions and haven't been very friendly to working class people. Though that is rapidly changing if you look at rhetoric changes, especially O'Toole's rhetoric and Poilievre's rhetoric compared to, say, Harper's rhetoric. It's very different. But let us continue here. So then we get to the Capital-Nationale, which I get a kick out every single time I see it, because, of course, Quebec would name their capital the national capital. Pardon, bear with me 1 second. Okay, we're back. So, this region here that I've selected, that's the Capital-Nationale region. This mostly includes Quebec City and some of its outer burbs. I would really argue Portneuf, Jacques-Cartier, and Beauport, Côte de Beaupré, Ile de Orleans, Charlevoix are, for lack of a better term, they're only loosely related to Quebec City. They are part of the burbs of the city. There's a lot of exurbs. There's a lot of parts of the community in it, the suburbs as well. So I think it is reasonable and fair to include them in this region. They are part of the census region as well, so they're being included as well. And they are actually very politically similar to the rest of Quebec City, and demographically similar, but it looks strange. So we got that. But what do we have with this? So percentages, again, will be easier to see here. So we have the same story in Quebec City as we have seen in we will keep seeing in Northern Quebec time and again. So early 90s, the Liberals are okay. They're doing decent. Conservatives are doing pretty bad. And this is, again, the early 90s, 2000 election are, these CPC numbers are the naive combination of the PCs and Reform, though most of the time there wasn't Reform candidates in most of Quebec, so that's easy. And the Bloc is doing quite strong in these times, as now. Now, however, in the last 3 elections, the Bloc's doing pretty weak, and they're typically trending away. Liberals are flat, arguably losing ground. The NDP is flat the last 2, the Green flat the last 3, and the only people who seem to be going up is the Conservatives. Now, arguably, like, you could say the Conservatives are flat. I would allow that assertion. But if you look at the macro trend here, they do seem to be doing slightly better over time. And this is one of the anomalies in Canada. Quebec City, de jure, is one of the most conservative cities in Canada. I think it is the third most in just raw number of, or raw percentages. First being Calgary, second being Edmonton. And when I say city, I mean the large cities of this country, like the 500,000 plus cities. It's the third most conservative in raw numbers. But proportionally, relative to the rest of the province it's in, Quebec City is actually the most conservative province in the country. Quebec, for example, in 2021, voted about 19% conservative, the entire province. Quebec City voted 37% here. That means Quebec City, by itself, votes 18 percentage points to the right of the province. There's no other city in Canada that is remotely similar. Calgary, the most conservative city in raw votes, votes 4 points to the left of Alberta. Usually. This is quite remarkable. Now, it could very well be the case that in Quebec City, specifically, the Conservatives are already hit their saturation point. And this is really their peak of how they will do in Quebec City. Now, they're not going to be doing remarkably better going forward. However, I don't think that is the correct way to look at it. Because if you look provincially at Quebec City, you get a very similar portrait. CAQ and the PCQ dominate Quebec City and the regions around it. The PCQ by itself gets very similar margins in Quebec City that the Conservatives get federally. It's a bit lower, I will agree. But we're still looking at 20%. That's not wildly different than the average the Conservatives have gotten in the last 30 years, which is 27. And the CAQ is getting about 43%, give or take, right now. That means, provincially, this is 63% right of center because the CAQ, no matter what you want to call it, is right of center. Even in Canada as a whole, the CAQ is right of center. I would argue Legault is more conservative than Doug Ford. And not even just in name, but in actual things he's done. Now, you might disagree with them, but if you consider the perspective of conservatism as conserving a culture, he is more conservative than Doug Ford is. Just on that itself. So this region is one. Not only are the Conservatives competitive on just global scale, but they have a lot of room to grow. What we have, for the most part, is we have these three ridings: Portneuf, Jacques-Cartier, Louis-Saint-Laurent, and Charlesbourg-Watt-Saint-Charles. Again, pronunciation might not be great. These are pretty much as safe as they come. They're not the most safe possible, but it would be shocking if any of these flipped. Almost unthinkable. In the event of a Conservative majority government, right now, we would almost certainly see Beauport-Limoilou and Beauport-Côte-de-Beaupré, Ile-de-Orléans, Charlevoix go Conservative. It's hard to imagine a scenario with the map as is, with the coalitions of the major parties as is, that they could win a majority government without winning those ridings. Similarly, you get Louis Hebert. Again, the Liberals are currently leading it, and I think realistically they would continue to lead it. But their lead in Louis Hebert, vis-a-vis the Conservatives, is not so strong as to be untouchable. Nor in Quebec, the riding, is it also that untouchable? We're only talking about a 17-point margin. Now, I don't think there really is any chance that the Conservatives could win Quebec, the riding. But it is not unreasonable that the Liberals could lose it to either the NDP or the Bloc, or if there is a mass switch to vote Conservative, the Conservatives could theoretically win it. It wouldn't be outside of the ballpark. Louis Hebert is much more likely. It's a 15-point margin over the Conservatives, give or take right now. But it seems extremely unlikely. Or not extremely, it seems unlikely. But not any more than winning Mississauga Lakeshore seems unlikely to me. Just to give you some perspective. So we have here is a pretty safe spot for the Conservatives. They can gain quite a bit of ground around Quebec City. And it's pretty conceivable that will continue going forward. Or we'll continue to see growth there going forward. Next here we got the Chaudiere-Appalches and Centre de Quebec. I combine these two not because politically necessarily they're super similar, but because demographically they're very similar. And I think the demographic and political are converging. So I won't really beat around the bush here. A lot of this region is deep conservative. Like, it's almost unthinkable that they could go anywhere else. The Chaudiere-Appalches over here includes things like Boyce and Bellachase, Etchens, Lévis, Mégantic, L'Herble, and Lévis Lotte-Binière. Again, pronunciation. It's almost unthinkable that any of these could go anywhere but conservative right now. I think these are all dead safe. And it's the idea that they could go anywhere else seems absurd to me at this point. I will put on a slightly lighter color Richmond Arthur basket here, not because I think the Liberals or the Bloc or the NDP or anyone else has any chance of winning this, just because Alain Reyes is now independent in that riding, and if he decides to run for re-election, I think there is a conceivable chance he might win as an independent there. I think it's very unlikely, but it is conceivable. So we have those. And the overall trend in this region, which is why I think this whole thing is going to converge very soon, is it's trending upwards, especially if we look at from 2011 onwards. Yes, I know 2011 is the point where the Conservatives do the worst in the province, so it's an easy point to compare against. But they've gained 40,000 raw voters in this region since then. You look at percentages, they've gained nearly 7% of the vote. And their previous high, 41, was dominating this region. You look at this removed from the Bloc, and since 2006, when the party formed, there's only been 2 elections where they got less than 50% of the vote there. Or the right has, I should say. And again, 2011 and 2015 are a bit anomalous because the NDP suddenly wildly does it really good in this region. And actually, 2015, the Bloc, or the Liberals, do quite well. Now, some of these regions, like SaintHeisen, Bigot, and, well, actually, specifically that one, I don't think it's extremely likely that we will see the Conservatives pick this one up right now. I would say this is probably one of the most core Bloc ridings there is. But these other two, Drummond and Bicancourt Nicolet Sorel, are something that is in consideration. Drummond is only about 25 points behind for the Conservatives. And yes, Bicancourt and Nicole Sorel, man, these Quebec ridings. That one's, again, 34%. But I'm just going to call it Bicancourt, whatever. What's boistering this one is Louis Plamondon is a long-term incumbent. He's been in for, I think, 30 years now. When he eventually retires, and he's fairly old, I think he's in his 80s. Let me just double check on my other screen here. He's 79, so he's going to be 81 probably by the next election. I think there's a very high chance that he'll resign either now or he will resign within this decade and just retire because he's old. And when he does that, I think this region will immediately and instantaneously become competitive for the Conservatives. I think it's very likely, even right now, if he retires, it is competitive. So since he's still in, I'm going to give this region this color. I think the Bloc are shoo-in to win it while he's the incumbent. But the moment he retires, I think this is going to be shifting Conservative. And Drummond here is, in the world where the Conservatives are winning a majority, is a target riding. Where they can easily, not easily, that's a bad way to phrase this, where I think they should be competitive, just like Lac Saint-Jean. These are ridings they should be able to gain ground in and possibly flip. It'd be an edge case flip, but I don't think it's out there flip. Moving on, because this is starting to drag on a bit, apologies, we get Central Quebec. Now, Central Quebec is not the best name for a region, I will concede, but it's the one we get. Central Quebec is the ones I am highlighting here. It's a bit of a grab bag of ridings, but the correlating factor is it's in the middle of Quebec. And demographically, it's still fairly similar. What I would call politically this region is it's the rural middle of Quebec, maybe small town middle of Quebec if you'd rather. And this is, again, a region where right now the Conservatives are not super competitive. But I think it's conceivable that in the future they could become competitive. In the past, such as 2006 or 2008, they have done fairly well here. And going forward, they have a good chance to continue to go forward, to gain more ground. I don't think it's likely in this decade, other than Trois-Rivières. And I don't really think there's much capacity going forward because the Bloc is quite strong. But the main component here, suppressing Conservatives' gains here, is the Bloc. Just one notable example, the PPC gained nearly 8,000 more votes from 2019 to 2021. It gives you an idea of how ripe this region is to gain more, to go more conservative, especially once if the Bloc keeps receding. And I think the point when Blanchette retires, I think this whole region will become open. Now, I would give the Liberals an edge right now, but that's not mean they will have the edge forever. Again, if we go to percentages, they're quite low, the Conservatives. I don't think there's really anything here but Trois-Rivières they're competitive in today or in a 2025 election. But the reason I bring this up is a smart, thought-out, long-term strategy. This should be areas the Conservatives can gain ground in. Any reason they don't is just a failure of campaigning. But to provide coloring, so Trois-Rivières in a Conservative majority should go Conservative. It's not guaranteed, it's not the darker blue, but they should be able to win it. They're already close to winning it presently. Most of these are dead safe Bloc for now. It's hard to imagine the Bloc not winning those. And the only one that is somewhat less safe, in my mind, is Berthier-Masconnaughey. Phrasing or pronunciation. And the only reason that one is less safe is just the NDP. For some reason that probably people from the area could probably describe better, this seems to be a very NDP-friendly region or riding, and I'm not 100% sure what's causing this. Probably something to do with the economy of the region. Maybe it's very unionized. Not 100% certain. But it is very NDP competitive, this region right here. And finally, we have Saint-Maurice-Champlain. And as long as Philip the Foreign Affairs... No, wait. What is his name? Francois Deschamps... Philip Francois Champ... What is it? What is his name? The cabinet minister. Bear with me. This is awkward. Francois Philippe. I was close. As long as he's the MP, I can't really imagine the Liberals losing it. I think he probably has it in the bag until he retires. Maybe if the Bloc really surges forward, but I'm not really seeing it. Separatism sentiment in Quebec is declining, and Quebec is shifting more right-wing, and maybe the Bloc will shift more right-wing with Quebec. But since the Bloc isn't right-wing, it's, I would say, roughly centrist in Canada. As the province shifts more right-wing, I don't really see the Bloc gaining more ground. And if the Conservatives are gaining ground, they have, I think, too much to come up with against an incumbent, long-term incumbent cabinet minister here. So I think Francois Philippe Champagne is probably pretty safe. And prior to the current iteration in the 90s and earlier, it was also liberal area, so he should be pretty safe. And then finally we have this last region. This doesn't really fit super nicely together, but it's just the rest of the province, so we get that. We have what I'm calling Western Quebec. The most haphazard, poorly grouping, because I didn't want to do two separate groupings of two ridings. That just seemed a bit ridiculous, especially since this video is already quite long. But the gist here is this riding is, again, or this region, you could conceivably see the Conservatives winning it, at least some ridings, especially Nunavik up here, because Nunavik is quite small and like actual number of voters wise. So a very good ground campaign can cause a big shift. But for the most part, this isn't really competitive. The Bloc should be able to win these two, and the Liberals should be able to win these two. And again, you look over time, the Conservatives are kind of flat, about 17%. Liberals are actually doing a bit better here than they... It's one of the only regions actually in Quebec where the Liberals, like in Northern Quebec, where the Liberals are not trailing the Chrétien era. A lot of Quebec, they were doing quite well in the 93 to 2000 time frame. In this region, they're just not trailing it. NDP is not super competitive anymore. So it's probably not a region where we're going to see much movement. And again, if you remove the Bloc, it's dominated by left-wing parties. So what I would say you're going to see here is probably something like this. Some of these regions, I think, are reasonably competitive between the Bloc and the Liberals, like Nunavik here, or Argentin, Le Petit Nation. Actually, let's distinguish this a bit more, actually. Let's do it like this. It's probably closer to that. But, again, it's kind of hard to imagine these really going anywhere. I would be surprised, actually. Even though Argentin, Le Petit Nation is fairly close, I don't really see it going anywhere. I think it'll just remain close. It'd be hard. Like, the Bloc would have to surge so high, and I think they're probably at their high watermark in the current era, because separatism's not very high in Quebec, and again, the province is moving to the right of the party. Whereas in the early 2000s, late 90s, the party and the Quebec as a whole was in line. So that's what we have for Northern Quebec. We have almost the entire province of Quebec done now, and the GTA, obviously. So there's quite a few regions that the Conservatives have the capacity to gain through, and I hope I'm really impressing upon people here that there is easily a path to a majority, especially if you start counting some of these more edge case ridings like Lac-Saint-Jean or Drummond, which seem unlikely, but if you look at the underlying details, probably are not as unlikely as you think. Albeit I don't think it's going to happen, but, it's conceivable. And going forward, there is definitely capacity for growth here. But that is what we will leave off for today. I don't know what's the plan for next week, but stay tuned and you will find out. But with that, if you liked the video, by all means, like, share, subscribe, comment below what you think. If you think I'm being too ambitious with some of the calls here, if you think the bloc actually has a chance of actually gaining more ground and isn't likely just a placeholder, because right now I think the bloc is just a placeholder. Quebecers don't really know who they want to vote for federally. If you disagree with that, by all means, comment below. Let me know what you think. Always love the comments. And with that, I bid you adieu, and I will see you next week with something else.